During World War II, flying boats proved their worth in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and there seemed to be no job they couldn't do. British four-engine Sunderlands hunted U-boats across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, dropped raiding parties, and flew round-the-clock radar patrols. American flying boats like the Catalina, Mariner, Coronado, and Mars flew search patrols across the Pacific. By eyeball and by radar, rescued downed airmen, tracked enemy subs, attacked surface ships with torpedoes and bombs, and hauled cargo and people. By the end of the war, the piston-powered flying boat had gone about as far as it could go. With virtually unlimited takeoff and landing space on open water, giants like the Martin Mariner and Mars could lift far heavier payloads than comparable land-based aircraft. And with full fuel tanks, they could stay on patrol over the ocean for 24 hours straight. But every flying boat had the same problem, and it was the hull itself. The step that let it break free of the water dragged like an anchor in flight, and it cost the airplane both speed and range. Meanwhile, as the Cold War hardened, the Soviet Union started putting submarines to sea in numbers nobody had seen before. The U.S. Navy urgently needed an aircraft that could operate from forward anchorages and carry modern anti-submarine weapons, including torpedoes and Lulu nuclear depth charges. There was also politics in it. In 1949, the Navy's bid for a share of the strategic nuclear mission was a supercarrier, the USS United States, and the Pentagon canceled her 5 days after her keel was laid. The money went to the Air Force and its B-36s, and the fight that followed is still remembered as the Revolt of the Admirals. Stung by that defeat, Navy planners looked for another route to the same destination, the Seaplane Striking Force, a force of jet-flying boats that needed no runways, no airfields, and no host nation's permission. Operating from tenders, submarines, and sheltered anchorages, a force like that could reach any coastline in the world, and you couldn't wipe it out with one strike the way you could wipe out a bomber wing. In April 1951, the Navy wrote the requirement that gave the whole idea its centerpiece. It asked industry for a seaplane that could carry 30,000 pounds of ordnance out to a radius of 1,500 nautical miles at speeds approaching Mach 0.9. The Martin Company had been building airplanes for the Navy since before the First World War. Right after the war, it developed the successful Marlin flying boat, which met nearly every U.S. Navy requirement except one: speed. So in 1952, Martin's engineers set out on an ambitious new project, a next-generation heavy jet seaplane that could outrun anything flying off a runway. Convair, the only other American company with comparable seaplane credentials, submitted a competing proposal. Martin's design won. Internally designated Model 275, the aircraft was built for anti-submarine and anti-surface warfare, mine laying, hauling cargo and people, and tactical photo reconnaissance. The Navy liked what it saw. It handed the design the designation P6M and shortly after the name SeaMaster. Unlike its straight-wing predecessors, the new aircraft was built for high subsonic speeds, better than 550 miles an hour. It had a high-mounted swept wing built around a multi-spar box structure with a thin airfoil and a sharp leading edge, swept back 40 degrees and spanning a little over 100 feet. The airplane measured 134 feet from nose to tail and stood nearly 34 feet tall on its beaching gear. Empty, it weighed a little over 97,000 pounds. Off glassy water, it could go to 190,000 pounds. In any kind of sea state, 160,000 pounds was the limit. 4 turbojets sat in paired nacelles above the wing roots, their intakes high enough to keep sea spray out during taxiing, takeoff, and landing. The nacelle design also let mechanics change engines right at sea with a crane from a seaplane tender, without dragging the airplane up a ramp. Roll control came from spoilers, much like on high-speed fighters, and the wing carried double-slotted flaps and leading-edge slats. Even so, the thin swept wing didn't make much lift down, low and slow, which put the landing speed up around 180 miles an hour. The multi-spar vertical fin was topped with a variable incident swept horizontal tail. The hull used a single-step design, and the cleverest thing about it was that the step retracted. In flight, it folded hydraulically up into the hull and took that extra drag with it. Like the best bombers of the day, the SeaMaster gave both pilots ejection seats. The rest of the crew got nothing of the kind. The mine-laying navigator, flight engineer, and radio operator gunner sat in a pressurized compartment directly behind the flight deck, and if it all went wrong, they had a hatch and their own 2 hands. The setup drew well-deserved criticism and a grim nickname: 2 survive, 3 die. Bailing out of an airplane doing better than 500 miles an hour was flatly impossible. Then again, ejection seats were bulky and heavy, and engineers would have had to build complicated hatches above them, hatches that had to blow clear on an explosive charge. That same compromise, seats for the pilots and a hatch for everybody else, showed up all over the period, and not just in America. Britain's V bombers had the same arrangement, the Vulcan and the Victor both. Right behind the cockpit was a so-called vestibule where mooring gear and anchors were stowed. It did triple duty, passenger cabin, cargo hold, and bunk room, because the SeaMaster was built from day one for multi-day missions far from home, resupplying at sea from ships and submarines. The main entry hatch was on the port side of this vestibule. Between the cargo compartment and the vestibule was a good-sized bay packed with avionics and electrical gear. Fuel tanks, environmental control units, and alcohol tanks for the de-icing system ran along the sides and upper section of the cargo bay. All these compartments were fully pressurized because the SeaMaster was also meant to double as a transport, moving troops and putting frogmen ashore where nobody was looking. The tail cone housed the auxiliary power unit, ammunition, tail turret drives, and fire control radar. In the design fashion of the day, the fiberglass tip floats were bolted straight to the wingtips, no struts at all, and in cruise they worked as end plates that boosted the wing's aerodynamic efficiency. Speed brakes on the lower sides of the aft hull could deploy independently while taxiing to act as a water rudder. Martin lifted the rotary bomb bay door straight from its own B-57 Canberra. The biggest maintenance headache was arming the aircraft. Loading weapons meant fitting temporary beaching gear and dragging the airplane up the ramp. Promotional brochures claimed the job was easy to do afloat. In practice, it was far harder. On the water, torpedoes and mines had to be craned through a hatch on top of the hull, and the awkward hatch placement meant the crew had to manhandle them a long way forward inside the hull. It was backbreaking work. The SeaMaster had no permanent wheeled landing gear, but the hull carried 4 heavy-duty attachment points for detachable beaching gear. The struts stowed in the entry vestibule, and the crew could rig them themselves, with no ground crew and no dock. Its avionics were state-of-the-art, matching the newest land-based bombers of the era, the B-47 and B-52. At the core of its targeting system was an APS-44 search radar from Hughes, tied directly into a radar bomb site. Production models were also to carry a mad boom in the tail, magnetic anomaly detection for hunting submarines. For defense, it carried a remotely operated tail turret, radar-directed, with 2 20mm Temco Ford Mark II-A cannon, 300 rounds apiece. But the main payload rode inside a unique rotary bomb bay, which could hold conventional and depth bombs, nuclear ones included, plus torpedoes, sea mines, and sonobuoys. It could lay just about every mine in the Navy inventory, 7 different marks, from the Mark X up to the Mark 52. For the strategic mission, the bay could take a pair of Mark 91 nuclear weapons or a single Mark 28. All told, the SeaMaster was rated for 30,000 pounds of bombs, mines, and torpedoes, comparable to the Air Force's land-based heavy bombers of the day. Interestingly, rails above the bomb bay door carried a trolley so a crewman could ride out over the bomb bay and eyeball the weapons in flight. It was staggeringly expensive. The Navy went all in anyway. The initial contract called for 2 experimental XP6M1 prototypes and a first batch of pre-production YP6M1 aircraft. Under a separate agreement, Martin also began developing an air-portable dry dock and everything a squadron would need to live away from land, since the Navy expected these aircraft to stay at sea for extended periods, refueling and resupplying from seaplane tenders and submarines. The prototypes got the Allison J-71, proven, reliable, and heavy. Each one put out 13,000 pounds of thrust with the burner lit, 52,000 pounds in total. The J-71 was not a glamorous choice. It was the same family that powered the McDonnell F-3H Demon and the Douglas B-66 destroyer, and it was picked for one reason: it already existed. Construction of the first 2 aircraft wrapped up by late spring of 1955. Both were assembled at Martin's sprawling plant at Middle River on the eastern edge of Baltimore, where the company airfield and its seaplane ramps at Strawberry Point ran straight down into the Chesapeake. On July 14th, following taxi tests and short hops off the water near Baltimore, the SeaMaster made its first flight over the Chesapeake Bay. The test pilots were thrilled with how responsive it was. It was 300 miles an hour faster than the P6M Marlin it replaced, and it matched the era's premier jetliner, the Boeing 707. Disaster struck on December 7, 1955, when the first XP6M1 prototype crashed. The crew was trying to land with the stabilizer trim jammed solid. It hit the water at close to 200 miles an hour with the nose way up. The back of the fuselage let go on impact and the crew was killed. Among the men lost was Lieutenant Commander Victor Utgoff, 40 years old and one of the most experienced seaplane pilots in the U.S. Navy. The date was the 14th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. The cause was identified almost immediately, a failure in the pitch control system. Heat and sound energy off the exhaust, loads nobody had calculated for, had locked the tailplane in the cruise position and the crew never had a chance to recover. Martin rebuilt the second prototype. Engineers beefed up the mounts for the flap actuators, the spoilers, and the tail assembly. Test flights resumed on May 18, 1956. The Navy had seen enough, and that August, it signed a $120 million contract with Martin for 24 production P6M SeaMasters, upgraded with much more powerful Pratt and Whitney J75 turbojets. The J75s put out 17,500 pounds of thrust each, dry, no afterburner, more than a third above the Allison, and it was the same engine that would go on to power the F-105 Thunderchief and the U-2 spy plane. Chief of Naval Operations Arleigh Burke watched the trials himself, and he called the SeaMaster the fastest low-altitude strike aircraft in the world at the time. Even Japan, a former adversary turned key U.S. ally in the Pacific, came looking. In June 1956, the SeaMaster was officially demonstrated to top officials of the Japan Self-Defense Forces, and they came away impressed. To keep hot jet exhaust from damaging the tail assembly, engineers radically redesigned the nacelles on 6 YP6M1 aircraft, canting the engines away from the fuselage centerline so the blast missed the tail structure, an idea drawn from British jets like the Comet and the Victor. Production P6M2s were to get the same arrangement. The air intakes also moved from the wing's leading edge to the top surface, giving the engines extra protection from sea spray, and the pre-production jets got uprated Allison-6s in place of the original -4s. To keep the flying boats supplied on the open sea, in late 1955, the Navy converted the Tench-class submarine USS Guavina into a sea-going tanker for seaplanes. Between 1956 and 1958, she took part in several naval exercises, successfully refueling and resupplying Mariner Patrol seaplanes. Had the SeaMaster entered service, it would have spent its life working off boats like her. The one major drawback, the submarine had no equipment to change heavy engines or load ordnance. The primary support ship was to be the seaplane tender USS Albemarle, built in 1940, pulled from reserve and extensively modernized between 1956 and 1957. They cut a ramp into her stern and fitted her with everything needed to service seaplanes on the open ocean, including a stabilized boom that let a SeaMaster moor up in a seaway without smashing itself against the hull. The holds of the 500-foot ship were to carry massive stores of spare parts, engines, jet fuel, and ordnance. She was due back in the fleet in '59. However, in late 1956, the program suffered a devastating blow. Severe tail vibration caused by the powerful exhaust stream tore the second XP6M1 apart in midair on November 9th over Odessa, Delaware. At around 21,000 feet, the nose pitched up and it quit responding to the controls. Martin's chief test pilot, Bob Turner, and his co-pilot, William Cunningham, called for everyone to get out. Every man made it, and every chute opened. Unlike the first accident, this one cost no lives. Still, Navy interest faded rapidly afterward, and by early '57, the order was cut from 24 airplanes to 18. Martin was left on the brink of financial collapse, with production of the earlier P6M Marlin ending and no other major contracts in the pipeline. Martin spent what money it had left on the YP6M1 and had one airplane ready for full-scale flight testing by the end of 1957. On January 20th, 1958, following water trials in the Chesapeake Bay, the updated SeaMaster made its first flight with completely redesigned engine nacelles and a modified tail fairing. This time the shaking was gone. The follow-up tests went well, with two more pre-production aircraft joining in 1958, and for the first time in years, things were looking up. The remaining 5 aircraft near completion at Martin's Baltimore plant would be converted straight into production standard P6M2s, with new Pratt & Whitney engines, the full avionics fit, an aerial refueling probe, and the defensive armament the prototypes had lacked. After years of engineering trouble, setbacks, and 2 crashes, one of them fatal, this radical jet seaplane, the largest and most seaworthy flying boat in the world, was finally ready for full-scale production. The first true P6M2 lifted off the Chesapeake on February 17, 1959, with Martin's chief test pilot George Rodney at the controls, and the numbers justified almost everything the program had cost. At 20,000 feet, it was clocked at close to 700 miles an hour, Mach 0.89. Service ceiling was 50,000 feet. Ferry range ran past 2,000 miles. With the full 30,000-pound load, combat radius came in around 750 miles, and aerial refueling stretched that past 1,700 miles. Flight Refueling Incorporated developed a compact probe and drogue system specifically for the SeaMaster. Mounted on the rotary bomb door, it let the massive seaplane double as an aerial tanker. By that summer, Navy crews were checking out in the airplane. Commander William Murphy, the 15th Naval Aviator qualified in the SeaMaster, flew as co-pilot alongside Bob Turner out of Strawberry Point and Pax River through 58 and 59, while Lieutenant Jim Campbell ran the armament test program and its weapons delivery trials. The flying was demanding in ways no land-based crew would have recognized. The airplane came off the water at roughly 145 knots, and high-speed taxi tests were done at better than 130 knots, so the SeaMaster spent long seconds tearing across open water at the cruising speed of a light aircraft, and anything floating out there could kill you. On one such run, it struck a line of fishing stakes and came away with a hole punched in the leading edge and a gouge running the full span of the right wing. Service entry was roughly 6 months away, but none of it ever came to pass. In mid-1959, the Navy took a hard second look at what the SeaMaster was actually for. The admirals decided carrier aircraft and helicopters could do the job better: anti-submarine warfare, aerial reconnaissance, mine-laying, all of it. There was no longer any need for a giant seaplane built to spend weeks battling high seas in the open ocean. 2 other programs had quietly taken everything the Seaplane Striking Force was supposed to deliver. The Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile handed the Navy its share of the strategic nuclear mission in a form no enemy could locate, let alone attack, and without a single crewman riding out a storm at anchor off a hostile coast. Meanwhile, the new supercarriers, the Forrestal class, and the nuclear-powered Enterprise behind them gave the fleet exactly the mobile forward airfields the flying boats were supposed to provide. The SeaMaster had been built to solve a problem that had ceased to exist. It was also the last survivor of a much wider effort that had already collapsed around it. Convair's F-2Y Sea Dart, a delta-winged fighter that rose off the water on retractable hydroskis, remains to this day the only seaplane ever to exceed the speed of sound. Yet only 3 of the 5 built ever flew. One disintegrated during a demonstration flight in 1954 and killed its pilot, and the Navy walked away by 1956. Convair's R-3Y Tradewind was the turboprop transport and tanker meant to haul the Striking Force's fuel and cargo, and only 11 were ever built, and unreliable engines finished the program off. The whole fleet was withdrawn and scrapped by 1958. By 1959, the SeaMaster was a soloist whose orchestra had already gone home. There was sound logic behind the decision. No matter how big you built a flying boat, it was still an airplane, and it could never match a surface ship in seaworthiness. And it wore the crews out, in the head as much as the body. Men were expected to live and work for days on end inside a cramped fuselage, constantly pitching and rolling on ocean swells. The Navy shut the program down entirely and canceled all remaining orders. The formal date was August 21, 1959. The order book tells the story better than any memorandum. The Navy had once planned on 48 SeaMasters. That fell to 24, then 18, then 12, and finally 8. Of those 8, only 3 ever flew. By the time the axe came down, the service had spent something like $400 million 1950s dollars on the aircraft itself and better than $500 million on the Seaplane Striking Force as a whole. Every airframe built went to the scrap heap, and the Navy turned down Martin's own executives when they asked to keep one. Airplanes that had cost millions apiece and accumulated only a few dozen flying hours were cut up for scrap at Baltimore. A handful of tail sections were kept back for structural testing, and that entirely unsentimental decision is the only thing that saved any part of the SeaMaster from the furnace. Today, the aft fuselage and tail of one aircraft sits at the Glenn L. Martin, Maryland Aviation Museum at Martin State Airport in Middle River, a few hundred yards from the ramps where the SeaMasters were built and launched. It is the largest surviving piece of the entire program. On December 20th, 1960, the Martin Company announced it was shutting down aircraft production entirely to shift toward rocketry and defense electronics. Since its founding in 1909, the company had delivered over 2,300 aircraft to the U.S. military and foreign allies, among them legendary flying boats like the Mariner and Marlin. The pivot was not a retreat so much as a reading of where the money and the future had gone. Martin had won the Air Force contract for the Titan intercontinental ballistic missile back in 1955, and it was that business, not airplanes, that carried the company forward. In 1961, Martin merged with the American Marietta Corporation to become Martin Marietta. It built the Titan family of launch vehicles that lifted American payloads into orbit for the next 4 decades. In 1995, it merged with Lockheed to form Lockheed Martin. The company that built the SeaMaster still exists today. It simply never built another aircraft of its own. The SeaMaster was supposed to be the next chapter for the flying boat. Instead, it was the last one.